again, what you wanted to be able to do is to at least list, and then list and define, and then list and talk about how the president has substantial tools to kind of meet this functional role, and therefore this position kind of enhances their power. Then you want to kind of look at it in the converse and think about the barriers. And so, in some ways, how does this position set the president up for failure? And then ultimately, you'd want to make your own determination as to whether or not the functional rules are a positive or negative. What you should have is chief executive, commander in chief, chief of state, chief legislator, chief diplomat. And then again, like I said, they're not all chiefs. There's manager of prosperity, where we're in charge of keeping the economy robust and money in everyone's pocket. What we didn't pick up on Friday with is party chief. And what we mean by that is, and what will be interesting is I'll juxtapose it in a second against chief citizen. The president is, both, you want to talk about setting the president up for failure, representing their party. Again, singular nature of the president sitting atop the executive branch means all the focus goes to them. So as the president does every single one of those other roles, in part they're not only serving the needs within those roles, but they're helping to define who the party is and what they stand for. So in that sense, even though there is a DNC, a Democratic National Committee. There is an RNC, a Republican National Committee. There is leadership within there that really kind of defines the daily operations of the party, both parties. The president is in some ways kind of autonomous and separate from that party mechanism. They certainly, probably often coordinate and work in partnership, but they're in two different spheres. Yet, because of the president's stature, everything they do kind of defines what the party is about, and therefore we kind of call them an architect of the party. Again, not only do they have the functional roles, they have the forums to communicate those, the party's agenda. Everything they do is newsworthy, and therefore the camera's on them. That having been said, again, you can kind of see the tools that they have at their disposal. Again, just the other functional roles and the visibility. In terms of, barriers, sometimes it's great to be associated with your party and to be kind of in the forefront of your party. Sometimes it's not great. Oftentimes there are cycles where parties are looked at favorably and unfavorably. So there may be points where you want to disassociate yourself with your party. Maybe there's a bad economic cycle, and your party is seen as the ones responsible for that bad economic cycle. Maybe there's a failed war, and again, you're associated with that. So, some of my exemplars here are a little outdated. There were a number of scandals at the time I last updated these notes, and scandals certainly are something that these ones are not going to be familiar to you, but the scandals, again, if your party is kind of mired down in conflict of interest scandals and seen to kind of abuse their office, well, that gets, hung on you. Now, not only are you representing a unique constituency, but, president has a national constituency, and they're supposed to represent all citizens. So, again, they have a number of tools to kind of serve everyone. Again, cycle back through the functional roles. Again, cycle back through the idea of their visibility and their ability to use the bully pulpit. Go back through the idea that they have the bureaucracy at their disposal. There's a lot of levers and buttons that they can push, but trying to serve everyone is, often it's a no-win game. Think of a policy that isn't polarizing. Either you're going to satisfy half the people and upset the other half, or vice versa. So with that, I leave off on the functional roles. But again, hopefully you can just be able to list, to define, and talk about what enhances and constrains, and ultimately kind of wonder if the functional roles are good, or whether they set the president up for failure. Now, having kind of looked at, if we think about what we've looked at so far, we've looked at just simply constitutional powers and constraints. And then we expanded a little bit. We thought more about the checks and balances that, again, enhance and constrain. And then from there, we went to functional roles. What we're going to start doing now is looking at the presidential establishment. I had mentioned, that there's over 3 million executive branch workers. When we, again, this is not the best cinematography, but there you go, Sydney. When we look at that, and that's nice, that's going to be on the YouTube. I guess what the kids call it. When you look at this chart, there's a bureaucracy that again, enhances and constraints. There are 3 million governmental workers. There's a $3 trillion budget. Certainly that's going to allow you to implement some things, you would think. But again, bureaucracies being what they are, they have a degree of expertise. The expertise creates efficiency, arguably, but also procedures and protocols. And that becomes the opposite of efficiency. Hey, this is the best way and the only way to do things. And therefore, any reform that you want has got to go through this filter. It slows things down. And in addition, bureaucracies often don't look to streamline. They look to complicate. And they look to expand because that's job security. So it's the grow or die mentality. Either I continue to grow and build positions and build powers, or there's going to be arguments for cuts. And so I look to expand just simply as a way to not contract, if that makes sense. All right? So we're going to begin to look at this presidential establishment, this bureaucracy, and I want you to think of it kind of in concentric circles. Where we'll start actually is in the outer circles. You would think vice president would be very close to the president, and in some ways they may be, but it often has to do with more personal chemistry than anything else. In terms of how the position is set up, it's going to be in one of those outer concentric circles. And then we'll work to the executive office of the president, the mini bureaucracy, or we'll work through, the cabinet, which again is in kind of an outer circle. And then we'll work to that, having set up the departments and agencies with the cabinet, we'll work to that EOP I mentioned, the executive office of the president that helps the president navigate all those other bureaucracies. And that begins to get in those inner rings, all right? So let's start with the VP and kind of talk about the vice president relative to the president. Again, their role, this is simple, is to stand in for the president. And that really was the main concern when the framers were constructing this position. You needed a fail-safe. If the president died or resigned or was impeached, we need someone to kind of fill in. Beyond that, not a lot within the constitutions. It says count the electoral votes, but it's not like you don't drop that administrative task in their lap and say, okay, physically 1 for you, 2 for me. They verify the results. So they're an official that kind of verifies the results formally. The other specific power on paper is the power to preside. They are, remember, the vice president is the president of the Senate. And again, it has to do with numbers in the Senate and a potential need. So why have somebody outside the chamber serve as serve as president of the Senate? What potentially can happen within the Senate, Ryan?
50-50 tie.
Yeah, it could be a tie. So you need somebody to come in and break that tie. For that reason, they set up the president, the vice president as president of the Senate, and they do give the VP power to preside. But the Senate. That with less numbers, they don't have to be as formal, and therefore, you don't often have the real power to preside. Without a real power to preside, why waste your time? Why sit there? When ties are coming. You've got leadership that does, remember, head counts or nose counts. We know when certain votes are coming down, and we know that there'd be a potential tie, and that's when the VP sits in. So, really what they do is they kind of serve as a head of state. They, go to the events that the president doesn't want to go to. Whatever weddings and funerals and ribbon cutting ceremonies that the president doesn't want to go to, that gets delegated to the VP. Let me check one thing, because I just got it in my head. Did I start recording? Are you there, Sydney? It appears to be recording, and there's a nice close-up for her. That's what happens on Mondays. So I didn't want Sydney to miss these fantastic quotes. If all you're doing is, essentially, acting like a turkey vulture, waiting for the president to get ill and, potentially take over, being the backup quarterback and hoping for the awful, and waiting for the occasional tie, and then mostly going to kind of ceremonial events, it's got to be, to a certain extent, highly frustrating, for an individual who had greater political aspirations. VP is obviously kind of a springboard to run for president. It gives you immediate credentials, but it's not always the case that VP will run as president. Joe Biden's a great example of that. He's tried running for president on multiple occasions. I think he does have a good degree of support, but for a number of reasons, political climate wasn't right for him. He had a whole host of personal affairs. The man's withstood a tremendous amount of tragedy, and been remarkably resilient as a result. I think people like him for that. But for him, his political career kind of is there and is stalled at that point, and that might be to a degree frustrating. So these quotes are great. John Adams, you got to decode it a little bit. He had he's always bitter. We talk about that. But he was bitter, I think, about becoming vice president and not becoming vice president with a unanimous vote. And then as he, got the office, and Washington taking a restrained approach, didn't have a lot for him. And so by definition, they set a precedent, and the office got kind of narrowly construed. His quote is that my country in its wisdom has contrived for me, has thought up for me, the most insignificant office ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. So I like that it is not only the most insignificant office in existence, it's the most insignificant office you could think of. That if you let your imagination run wild, this is as dull as it gets. And then John Nance Gardner, who was the VP to FDR, equated it to not being worth a warm bucket of spit, which you would not pay for, I assume. You would pay somebody to get this away from me and don't slosh it on your way out. It is frustrating to some people. So what's the real significance of the VP? Well, where you see, again, remember we talk about sometimes checks are only effective in their threat. Sometimes it's the, you kind of have to look at not giving someone the vice presidency and looking at the office itself. You want to kind of look at the, how do I want to phrase this? What goes into becoming VP and realize that it's there is the significance. What the VP does, or where the VP is actually powerful, is before they come VP. Where you see their greatest significance is before an election, because that's where all the leverage exists. So a president knows they need a particular vice president to balance the ticket. And there's a number of ways that a VP balances the ticket. It could be based on any factor, really, but let's talk liberal versus conservative. You've got a Republican candidate. They're seen as kind of, staunchly conservative, and they want someone more middle of the road to balance them ideologically, or do it vice versa for a Democrat. Make the Democratic presidential candidate highly liberal, and they pick someone more conservative. It could be based on geography. You've got someone from the Northeast, and they want to pull somebody from the West or from the South. Gender could be a balance. Ethnicity could be a balance. Religion could be a balance. Different types of political experience could be a balance. One of the great ones to think about, because it's really characterizing this current race, is political insider versus political outsider. We tend to gravitate towards, during elections, to political outsiders. If you're frustrated with Washington and its business as usual approach, you think an outsider is going to come in and shake it up. And I want someone with business experience, or I want somebody who, is not going to be corrupted by special interests. And so we look for those political outsiders. Well, great. What happens when they get into office and, again, they have no political experience, and how do they govern? And so you might look to balance them with a political insider who knows how to navigate. the bureaucracy and there's another term for it too, by the way. It's called inside the Beltway versus outside the Beltway. You're familiar with like 495 and how 95 ring Boston? Well, there's a Beltway that rings, a highway that rings Washington, D.C. And the insiders are called inside the Beltway people. And then the people that are kind of rubes and hicks that are kind of outside of politics, they're outside the Beltway type people. Okay? So what I want you to understand is there's a number of kind of very important factors that go into selecting a VP. And the president, is going to depend on that VP as they balance the ticket for an electoral boost. That gives the VP some leverage. That's when they're important because what they can demand in exchange is, for example, let's say it's Hillary Clinton and it's Bernie Sanders, and Hillary Clinton starts to kind of pull forward, and she's looking to kind of, let's. You're being recorded right now, so watch the cord if you would, and then I'll cut the recording and you can pick up from where we are. It's been great so far.